My goal is to get in contact with inspiring future leaders, feminine leaders of planet Earth. For me, the challenge is how do I make it a nice podcast even I'm traveling?
They like to be guests, and also it's so beneficial for them because you're promoting them really. And so you can aim for like around 10x your following. Hi, and welcome to this new episode of my podcast debut, where I interview people like Pina who want to start their podcast, and hopefully that inspires you and you learn a lot from this too if you're in the process of starting, launching your own podcast. And Pina, so it's you've done another interview before, but it's one of your first ones. I'd love to ask you first, how do you feel?
I felt, I feel good. I like to have a conversation with someone, and also I like actually the fact that you record it, because then we can inspire other people. Because I feel like when two people come together and another person listens, just gets inspired.
I love that. Thank you. And actually, that's something when we talk about podcasting, often it can be easier to have conversations rather than speak alone in front of the camera. So that's a very good point. I'd love to ask you, Pina, what is your podcast idea?
So yeah, this is now actually interesting. So I have two podcast idea. The first one is with a friend of mine. We want to do a blog, Eat, Pray, Fuck is the name. And we want to do a podcast about it, about dating stories, travel stories. And the second thing, that's why I actually also in this podcast with you, to get some clarity, I would love to have a podcast where I interview women who are on their soul's mission and to ask them what they inspired to really step into their inner calling and why they do the visions or the work they do. So kind of like a soul-led women podcast.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing. So, two podcast ideas today.
Yes.
I'd love to ask you, if you were to prioritize one, which one would you be?
If you ask me today, actually, it would be the soul-led women. Yeah, because I feel it's with one of it. It's in alignment with my bigger vision the most.
Thank you, Pina. Okay, so we can focus on this one. I'll just share a word with the other one you shared. Obviously, it really depends on your relationship with the person. But my experience, I've done two podcasts with a co-host, and it's great. And when I had a co-host and a guest, for example, it starts to be a little bit quite a few people to start with. That's one thing. And another thing is the relationship needs to be really solid for the long term, because podcasting is generally something that works well long term. So if you had like a business partner or someone you want to build with for the next 5 years, I think it's amazing. But in my experience, for example, when I've done it, it's been collaborations of like 6 7 months, and then if the collaboration doesn't keep going with the person, then the podcast is really affected from that, versus having your own podcast can give much more flexibility and longevity, right? So that's something to take into account also, for sure, that it's more of a long-term game, and depending on who you do it with, it can be more or less aligned. Yeah. Awesome. So that podcast, can you tell us a little bit more about what the goals are with this podcast?
So my goal is to get in contact with inspiring future leaders, feminine leaders of planet Earth. So I was like, if I'm getting them into an interview, right? Like I'm already building kind of my community, because I want to build a community where I link all the feminine leaders together. So yeah, by interviewing them, I'm basically creating a relationship with them, creating the foundation.
Amazing. Thank you, Pina. So, yeah, there's a lot when you read podcasts, and networking is a big thing. So, it's actually good to be clear for people, like what's the priority? Is it learning? Is it networking? Is it monetization? Is it getting views? And so in your case, the first thing that comes to your mind is networking and connecting with these women.
Yeah, networking and connecting women, plus also through the conversations, right? Women sharing their vision and mission, and other people getting inspired. What I said before, like in conversations, like
Mm,
I feel there's a lot of inspiration can come out of
inspiration.
the conversation part.
Mm, I love that. That's a really good idea. And on top of it, I imagine that these women would probably already have a community and a following. So you could leverage those podcasts with cross promotions and also expand your reach through those cross promotions.
Exactly.
Very smart ideas. Can you share a little bit more about the practicalities? Like, do you want to do video in person or online? Only with guests or also solo episodes?
Yeah, so I thought it will be because I'm traveling a lot, so I have to have it online at the moment. But I would love to have at one day like a studio where women like I see it really like I start now have not so many famous women on it yet, but eventually I really want to have like the most amazing, incredible leaders on it, and then I would love to have a studio where they come. But for now, I would need to start online because I'm traveling the whole time.
Mm, amazing. Yeah. And online obviously offers that flexibility. And on top of it, what I've noticed with my own experience and also studying older podcasts and YouTube channels is that you can do really, really well online. And the studio definitely reinforces however good your content is with the beauty of the production. But it's not the main component. And I know because I used to record in a studio and that wasn't making the views. And most of my top episodes, they actually recorded online. However, when people look at the biggest podcasts, most of them are in studios. But the reason why they're in studios is because they're already really big. They already found their audience and their market. And then it makes sense to put the extra effort into the studio. But it's more that cherry on the cake type of thing. Yeah. So I love how you're approaching it with that. Tell us also who would be your dream guest.
Who would be my dream guest? So, okay, my dream guest actually, Angelina Jolie would be my dream guest. Oprah Winfrey would be my dream guest. Um, if time wouldn't play a role, right? Like, I would love to interview Jeanne d'Arc, Johanna from Orleans. She would be like my, if she would be still alive. Um, yeah,
And Mary Magdalene, of course.
Mary Magdalene for sure.
if,
Yeah.
if we really get outside the box.
Yeah, with Mary Magdalene, I feel she lives through all of us women. I feel like
Mm.
her, all of us women embody part of her. Yeah,
Thank you. And I was quoting her also for the viewer because you um, called her energy as a intention setting for our podcast. So that's also why. Thank you so much, Pina. And again, thank you for coming here. Thank you to everyone who's watching this right now. I hope this is already inspiring and enlightening. And if you want to come on the show, like Pina is doing right now, and talk about the podcast that you want to start, have a look at the description. And there's the process how you can get in touch with me and be interviewed also for my podcast debut. And yeah, Pina, I'd love to know, when do you want to start?
to be honest, as soon as possible, I would like to start.
Mm, great,
But I
great.
just I don't know what it takes. Like if you can start in 2 days, if it's like easy or
Yeah, thank you. Look, it depends. What I usually recommend is to take a little bit of like a week to get really clear on name, audience, do a little bit of market research, just that little bit of slowing down to start from the right foot, and then already start the process of figuring out what are the first episodes, inviting the guests, and then week 3 recording, with week 4 publishing. So that's usually how I work with my clients. Is week 1 is more positioning. Week 2, I call it the activation, where you invite the guests, create the channel. Week 3 is the recording, and week 4 is the launch. So this can be a little sped up, or it can be slightly longer, depending on depending on a few things and how much we perfect the brand and these parts. If you had a really good, if you really wanted to start, next week, you could too, right? And they both have their pros and cons. Depends also how um it depends. For some people, the most important is to get started because they've been procrastinating, and then if they can start next week, it's perfect. And for some people, especially if they're a bit more established, sometimes it takes a bit it's smarter to take a little bit more time to think it through, and then when you start, you're more ready. Where do you feel you're at with this?
Okay, yeah, I'm just got the idea. Okay, then I would do some market research first. I'm wondering also with the name, I'm not 100% sure if I should ask my Instagram community about the name, which one they would go for, and make a little survey.
That's a really good idea. For this YouTube channel, I also asked in my other YouTube channel and on my Instagram, just to fill into the response. And it doesn't mean you have to go with whatever wins, but it will give you an idea. So I love playing with ChatGPT for names, and then going to the community that you already have, or to a few trusted people that you can talk with. Also, that would be the 3 things. ChatGPT would be to brainstorm, or could be with a coach also, but I would do it with ChatGPT. And then ask your audience to get more like people who follow you, and that more personalized feedback. And then either a coach or a mentor of yours, or people that will be the right audience, and maybe sit down with them and have a bit more of that qualitative feedback also. Yeah. Do you have some specific podcasts or YouTube channel that are especially inspiring to you already?
Which I follow? You mean?
Yeah, and that you find inspiring for your own podcast or YouTube channel.
In general, what I'm listening to at the moment is the Diary of a CEO, and I really like the way he has conversations with his guests.
Mm. What do you like
Yeah.
about it?
Mm, I like the question. I like the questions. The way he just asks questions. Like I remember he was like, this was an episode about a couple in Cape Town, and if the I don't know who was on the show, but recommend how would you start a business, and then he gives really good, like the guests really give good advice for young people.
Mm.
Yeah,
Yeah, I love that.
and
He's
also out
also
of that
very. Yeah.
podcast, I got sorry.
There you go.
So, yeah, out of that podcast, I got that podcast is actually the future now, because we are tired of watching these small videos, like like only a few seconds, and to make a bigger picture, to actually really get to know a person, you want to spend more time with them. So on a podcast, if you have like an hour conversation, you really get to know a person, and I really want that people get to know me, but also get to know the future leaders, family leaders. So that was like, okay, podcast is definitely the way to go.
Mm. Yeah, it is. It is a way to have massive impact. Also, I think it was quite interesting during the U.S. election. Also, just having Trump on Joe Rogan made quite an impact. Maybe more than some of the traditional news and debate systems. So it is changing, and podcasting is having a big role. And back to the area of a CEO, I really like also how he asks the question, and I can see he's intentional also about how it's gonna look in clips, because the clips are also really good, but there's a way when you do a podcast where you can ask the questions that are quite short and to the point, and that can be clipped more easily. I'd love to ask you, Pina. So you want to start as soon as possible, which is amazing. You're excited to have your podcast. What are some challenges that you're facing?
So for me, the challenge is like, how do I make it a nice podcast even I'm traveling, right? How I make it look professional even I'm traveling, like that's the thing. Um, and the second thing is, yeah, to get women on board, but I would actually start with other women who are kind of in the same situation as I am, who are coaches, right? And basically interview coaches. I think I would start with that, like starting with light workers and then going from there, um, yeah, up to other women.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. So yeah, regarding those women, I find that when you interview people on a podcast, people like to be interviewed. They like to be guests, and also it's so beneficial for them because you're promoting them really. And so you can aim for like around 10x your following. So for example, let's take Instagram. I have close to 6,000 followers. I can go to people with 50 to 100,000 followers and be, hey, do you want to be on my podcast? And if it's aligned and I'm curious, obviously, it's quite likely that they'll say yes. If I go to people with 2 million followers, they'll probably ignore it. They'd rather be on a bigger podcast. Might not be worth their time. Um, there can be exceptions, but that's in general. But so you can aim for that 10x. And then if you do cross promotions, it can also really help to get visibility. So that's one thing. And then regarding the equipment, if you travel, look, for me, I've recorded almost all my podcasts on my iPhone 15. Like a few months ago when I was in Germany, I just found a white wall and recorded in front of it. It looks good. Obviously, if you have an amazing podcast studio and all that, it helps even better. But um, yeah, simplicity is also important, because from the moment you have a lot of equipment, more points of failure or something that may not work. Uh, so yeah, keeping it simple. And as you're traveling, I would say, yeah, what are you recording on right now?
My MacBook Air.
Your MacBook. Okay. So have a look at the result, but usually it can be really good already. Maybe you don't need anything else. And a little bit
Amazing.
similarly
We'll
to
see.
to what I shared with the studio, yeah, it's like also from the beginning, obviously you want it to sound good enough that if it sounds bad, people don't want to listen. And then how it looks like, yeah, you don't want it to be like too too blurry or something. You want the background to be a little bit clean. That's also your image, but it's kind of doing the 80-20, right? The 20% of uh, what really matters to give 80% of the results. And then once you're in a good flow, once you're getting bigger guests, once you're getting more subscribers, all of this, tackling the smaller things that make the difference at that moment. Yeah. And also by that time, you'll be much better at doing the podcast in itself. So it's perfect. Yeah. So
Amazing.
Pina, I'd love to ask you,
Thank you for the
do you
tips.
have, yeah, do you have any other questions or things you want to share?
No, I just wanted to ask you again. How did you start your first podcast?
Mm, thanks for asking. Yeah. I was about 7 years ago, and I interviewed my best friend at the time that was doing very successful AI courses on Udemy. And yeah, I I didn't do on video, but from my second podcast, I did on video. And I just bought a mic, like a relatively cheap one. I was like, let's do it. And we had a conversation and felt a little bit weird. I felt a little bit of that imposter syndrome. But I did it and we posted it and it was awesome. Yeah. And quite quickly, actually, I got to interview for my podcast people that I felt were a little bit out of my leagues, and it really gave me the experience of knowing that this podcast was really helpful to learn from those amazing people and to network, to get connected with people who would not have said yes if I asked them if they wanted to sit down with me for an hour and have a conversation. If it wasn't recorded and for the podcast, they would not have said yes. But then because it was a podcast, I could sit down with these people, learn from them, connect with them, and it's been such a great journey that has shaped my life a lot in the past 7 years. Yeah, it's like an adventure. Mm.
Thanks for sharing.
And yeah, and a lot of
It also
people that
started
I
with a
know,
conversation.
and yeah, a lot of people that I know and the experiences I've had has been through the podcast also. So, for example, I think 4 or 5 years ago, I did a podcast with two brothers who did a 40-day fast, water fast, and they connected me with someone who did my iridiology reading here in Bali, and that got me onto a raw vegan diet, and then that has become in turn something that I've been speaking a lot about in my podcast. So it's just been really interesting to be thrown into that new adventure in life through the podcast and through that connection, and then making it something that I talk a lot about in the podcast now, and having some of the top leaders in the world on that topic. So that's the kind of adventures you can go into. Anything else?
Um, no, so I know, right? You use Riverside. I just see it now, so I know what platform to use already.
Yeah, it
And
is good.
yeah, I think.
And actually, today, just to be totally honest, today we're having like the connection is a little bit lower because here in Bali sometimes it's not as good. So I can feel there's a little bit of delay. So that rarely happens, to be honest. But it's good to have the experience and to know that's one of the things with online with the conversation is rarely happens, but sometimes you can have that little delay that makes it a little bit harder to have the direct interaction.
Okay. No, you already asked me the questions, which I kind of know now what to do.
Mm. Yeah, thank you.
Thank
So
you.
to close this, I'd love to ask you, Pina, what are your main takeaways from our conversation today?
Yeah, my main takeaway is again that you basically can start a podcast anytime, but also to you encourage to do a little bit of market research and that it is about conversations.
Amazing. So what are your next
And I
steps?
just know now where I should. Where
Amazing. So what are your next steps?
my next steps is that I'm gonna speak a little bit with ChatGPT about this idea about names and post my names in my Instagram and ask my Instagram to also vote for it. So basically, yeah, do a little market research, and then I'm reaching out to potential women I want to interview, and then it's about recording.
Amazing. Amazing. I love that. Action taker. Thank you so much, Pina. And
Yeah.
yeah, I look forward to seeing your podcast. And thank you for everyone who's watching. And thank you for being there. I hope you got inspired. If you want to support the channel, of course, you can subscribe, like, leave a comment. I read them all, answer to them all, and share with friends. And if you want to come on the show to talk about your podcast, just let me know. I would love to interview you too about your podcast idea. Much love, everyone.